Chapter 6. Stephanie held Erica's lifeless hand in shock and horror. This was not the future she had seen. This was not the price she had prepared herself to pay. A great, bitter feeling welled up inside her as Victor closed her distant eyes. "We have to get out of here," shouted Lucas. Victor began tugging on Stephanie's arm to pull her up, and Jonathan pulled on Kirana's arm to try and coax her, but the two women longed to stay by Erica. Jennifer was also shaken up, as she had been the one spared by Erica's sacrifice. "Erica," whispered Jennifer in shock. "We must go," whispered Victor as he took her hand. As tears streamed down their faces, they slowly got up and began moving away. It was just in time to avoid another energy surge in the ground. The attack made Stephanie angry. "We need to pull his attention away from that spot," said Lucas. "Then, Lizard, we need you to retrieve the Heaven Shield key." "Leave it to me," said Lizard. The others began pulling out weapons and firing toward Abaddon. Using pieces of rock and concrete as shielding, they made their way closer to the destroyer's position. "Back so soon, Jennifer Cedar," said Abaddon with a sneer. "I know who you are, Daniel Young," shouted Jennifer. "That name no longer applies to me," said the destroyer. "I am Abaddon." "Your name will not save you," shouted Jennifer angrily. Kirana fired a sniper round that pushed Abaddon onto his back. He slowly got up, then swung his arm toward her, firing a dark beam. Stephanie pulled Kirana out of its path in anticipation. "Your weapons cannot hurt me," shouted Abaddon. He slammed his claws into the earth, and another dark shockwave flew toward Kirana. Stephanie stood up to absorb the attack, but Jonathan rushed toward them and pulled them both to safety before the wave could strike. "Be careful," whispered Jonathan. Stephanie shoved Jonathan onto his back, causing him to narrowly avoid a cutting beam attack. He looked back at Stephanie. If she could speak, she would have told him to be careful himself, but he knew that just by the expression on her face. Sig groaned in pain as a cutting beam pierced his gut. Abaddon laughed with sadistic pleasure. Victor rushed up behind Sig and placed his hand on the wound. Sig groaned again as he was healed. "So you have taken my old key," said Abaddon in a low voice. "But you should know its limits. How long can heaven's breath save you?" He fired another cutting beam. Jennifer pulled the two of them out of its path with her time-slowing ability. "Hurry up, Lizard," whispered Lucas as he began modifying explosives from his pack. Roedy 2 rushed up next to him. "Need a hand?" he asked. Lucas nodded. "We're going to have Lizard place these around him with his teleport," said Lucas. "That's smart, since conventional weapons don't seem to be working," agreed Roedy 2. "You see how the detonators work?" asked Lucas. Roedy 2 held his key and his eyes began glowing. "I do now," he said. "Well, take cover and get to work," said Lucas as he tossed a brick of explosive clay toward Roedy 2. He grabbed it out of the air and nodded. Lucas gave a look of surprise. He was impressed with the augment's willingness to help, and his ability to quickly understand this strategy. Another moment later, Lizard appeared next to Sig, holding a mirrored key attached to a silver chain. "I found it," said Lizard as he handed the key to Sig. Sig smiled and took it. The moment it touched his hand, Sig's eyes began glowing brightly. He smiled widely and turned toward Abaddon. "That's enough," shouted Sig. "So you picked up Drew Baker's key," said Abaddon. "It didn't do him a lot of good." "He didn't know you the way that we do," said Sig. "You didn't know me either," said Abaddon with a laugh. "Let's see how you handle the same dilemma." Abaddon pointed 2 claws in different directions. One was pointed toward Sig, the other toward Kirana. "Not good," shouted Lizard. The beams began to fire. To Lizard's surprise, he saw Jennifer rush toward Kirana. Lizard smiled. He was fast enough to push Sig out of the way. As he pushed Sig to the side and looked around, he noticed Lucas looking at him as if he was calling him over. He knew at once that he had a strategy, and smiled as the beams missed their targets. An instant later, he stood next to Lucas. "What do you have?" asked Lizard. "Bombs," said Lucas. "Relegated has some as well. I want you to put them all around places he might go." "Got it," said Lizard. "Wait," shouted Lucas. Lizard paused. "Flip the switch on the side when they're placed. We don't want to accidentally detonate them while you're holding them." "Good call," said Lizard with a smile. "Very clever," said Abaddon. He pointed both of his open claws at Sig and fired. Sig held up his hands. Instead of a bubble around him as Drew had made, a flat rectangular panel that gleamed with golden light appeared in front of Sig's hands. The force of the beams pushed against Sig, but he quickly leaned forward and pushed back against the beams. "How long can you keep that up?" asked Abaddon. "Longer than you," said Sig with a wide smile. "I don't require constant human sacrifices." "But there is a price you pay to wield divine keys," said Abaddon. "You can't do it indefinitely." "I was chosen to bear this heavenly shield because I am willing and able to pay the price to defeat you," said Sig as he pressed forward against the beams. "How can you say you are willing and able if you do not know what the price is?" said Abaddon as he intensified the beams. Sig's feet began sliding back as he pushed in the dirt. Suddenly an explosion went off next to Abaddon, throwing him into the air. The sudden lack of pressure on Sig's shield caused him to fall down on his face. Lizard laughed as he watched Abaddon plummet to the earth again. He quickly teleported near the spot to which the destroyer was falling and switched on another explosive, then teleported away. The moment Abaddon hit the ground, the next explosion went off. "Great work!" shouted Sig with a smile as Lucas prepared for another signal from Lizard. Another explosion blasted Abaddon backwards and forced him to skid against broken chunks of asphalt for several yards. "Don't stop, Lizard!" shouted Lucas. Lizard tossed another explosive at Abaddon's face. Just before it arrived, Lucas hit the remote detonator. The explosion carved a crater into the ground. "He's still there," shouted Row 82 as he looked toward the pillar of smoke with his glowing eyes. Another 4 explosives were switched on and tossed toward Abaddon. Row 82 and Lucas fired them off simultaneously. The blast launched tons of earth and debris into the sky. Over the next 2 minutes, dirt, rocks, ash, and other debris rained down all around. Stephanie pointed out a spot where less debris would fall. To her surprise, Lucas and Row 82 were headed for the same spot based on their observations of the blast. The air became thick with dust, to the point where visibility was reduced to a few feet. As the air began to clear and visibility returned, they looked back toward the crater, hoping that their explosive attacks had defeated the destroyer. Row 82 gave a loud shriek and listened carefully. Suddenly he turned and pulled the others down. "Get down!" he shouted as he yanked on Lucas and Stephanie. Sig stood up and created a golden shield, absorbing their force. Unfortunately, the beams had already cut through Jonathan's stomach. He choked and coughed blood as he fell to the ground. "Jonathan!" shrieked Kirana as she rushed to him. Victor quickly joined her and began the painful process of forcing the wound to close. "Tell me he'll be okay, Victor," said Kirana. "It's not good," said Victor as he examined the gash. A huge chunk of organs had been vaporized as the cutting beam had hit his abdomen. He almost immediately lost consciousness. Kirana looked toward Abaddon's figure as it appeared in the crater below them and clenched her fists angrily. She could not believe that this was the same man that had so carefully tended their wounds for years. Tears poured down her face as she turned back to Victor. He worked diligently, and flesh began to grow around the wound. He was no doctor, but she knew that survival after losing a chunk of organs and having blood freely flowing from the open gash would be impossible without a miracle. She took Jonathan's hand in hers. "Jonathan, you idiot," she whispered. "Don't leave me. I can't lose you. I can't... She pressed her lips against his as her tears dripped onto his face. She did not care what any of the others thought. She only wanted him to be okay. Suddenly, Kirana's divine key began glowing. Stephanie's eyes grew wide, but Kirana did not seem to notice. Kirana could not tell that her eyes had begun glowing. "I think you'll be okay," said Victor as Jonathan coughed and began breathing. Victor's eyes were still glowing, and he had not let go of the injury, but there was a confidence in his voice that gave Kirana peace. She felt a level of calm and relaxation that she had not ever felt before. "Now use that sword and stop him," said Victor. Kirana's glowing eyes grew wide. She looked down and noticed her key glowing brightly. The light around the key was taking the shape of a sword. She furrowed her brow and turned toward Abaddon, who was still shooting cutting beams toward Sig. Suddenly, Stephanie grabbed her arm and pulled her down, shaking her head as if telling her not to go yet. "What is it?" asked Kirana in a sincere tone. Stephanie sat down in the dust and drew with her finger. As she did, her own eyes began to glow. She drew a group of circles together and drew an X shape some distance away. She pointed at the X and then at Abaddon. Kirana understood what she was saying. Stephanie drew another X with a group of circles and pointed at her. Kirana understood that this X represented her. Stephanie drew a curved line that went back and forth and circled around before stopping at a point right next to the X representing Abaddon. Kirana nodded and began to run out. She carefully followed the shape of the pattern that Stephanie had drawn. As she did, a cutting beam headed her direction. She rolled forward and darted the other way, maintaining the path Stephanie had directed her to follow. She rushed back and forth as the cutting beams flew toward her, and it became clear that Stephanie had given her the perfect approach. "What do you think you're doing, Kirana Sepharvaim?" shouted Abaddon as he slammed his claws on the ground and sent an energy wave through the ground. Kirana circled back, narrowly avoiding the attack. Abaddon stuck out his hands, preparing a cutting beam. A moment later, he began slashing with his beam across the area where Kirana had run. Dust filled the air as the earth crumbled to fill the vacuum created by the vaporized ground below. After a minute of slashing, Abaddon stopped and waited. "She couldn't have survived that," whispered Row 82. "The beams would have either cut her or forced her to fall too great a distance." It took another minute before the dust settled. A golden ball began to appear from behind the cloud of dirt. It gently evaporated, revealing a small figure. Row 82 spun around to see Sig's eyes stop glowing. "You protected her," he said. "I try to protect everyone," said Sig with a wide smile. Kirana lunged toward Abaddon with her energy blade and impaled him in the gut. Abaddon choked and blood spurted out from both the wound and his mouth. "Your rampage ends here, betrayer," shouted Kirana as she pulled her blade out of the destroyer's abdomen. "Not yet," choked Abaddon. "I will have the power of the archdemon." He turned his claws backwards and fired a pair of dark flames that propelled him into the air like a rocket. In a matter of seconds he was out of sight. Kirana clenched her teeth as she watched him disappear. She jogged back to the others. "Kirana," whispered Jonathan weakly. "Jonathan," said Kirana, who was relieved to see him speaking. He looked exhausted, but there was a smile on his face. She smiled back at him. "What did he say?" asked Lucas impatiently. "He said he would have the power of the archdemon," said Kirana, "whatever that means." "So Archdemon's Hand is not just a name?" asked Lizard with air quotes. "There is an actual archdemon?" "Yes," said Lucas. "I believe that is right. The demon keys must have come from some actual place. But if the archdemon is real, and if it is so powerful, then why is it not out destroying everything?" "Because it is imprisoned," said Victor. Everyone turned and looked at him. His head was tilted sideways, and there was a glazed look on his face. He pulled Jonathan in front of him and pressed a knife against his throat. "What are you doing, Victor?" shouted Kirana. "Leave Jonathan alone." "William Fine," said Row 82 angrily. "The puppeteer is controlling him." "Guilty as charged," said Victor. "What?" shouted Kirana. "I had intended to take control of Timothy Young," said Victor, "but I see the Heaven's Breath Key has a new bearer. Victor, was it? Well, no matter. He will be providing me with immortality." "Let him go," shouted Jennifer angrily. "Why would I do that?" said Victor. "Not even the Heaven's Breath Key will be able to heal you after I'm through with you if you don't release him," said Jennifer. The others were surprised at the intensity of her voice. "You haven't been able to do anything in the past 500 years, Jennifer," said Victor. "You abandoned your first council. You couldn't do anything to save Peter's council, and just because you've managed to find a new group of ignorant people you've suckered into the job now doesn't mean you will succeed." "We will succeed," affirmed Jennifer. "Hang on," said Victor. "Even when you first showed up with that time key, you've never sounded like that." Victor pressed his knife harder against Jonathan's throat. "So don't try anything, Jennifer. I will kill this guy if I see your eyes change color at all." Jennifer clenched her fists angrily. She knew that she would not be fast enough to slow time down and save Jonathan. She looked at Kirana, who seemed equally angry and unsure about what to do. After having seen the destroyer blast himself south and being caught in a standoff, she had a feeling that she was too late for something. "And as for the rest of you," started Victor, "though I can't control all of you at once, I can at least paralyze you." A moment later, each of the key bearers was immobilized. Jennifer struggled to move, as did the others, but none of them were able. Lizard attempted to teleport, but he could not move either. Jennifer looked into Victor's eyes when she caught hold of a sight that distracted her. Jonathan's eyes had begun to glow. Even in his weakened state, Jonathan had gone to the mind realm to fight William Fine and try to free them. It was a courageous move, but he did not know how courageous it was until reality faded away and revealed the monstrosity that had wrapped itself around Victor. Hundreds of long tentacles swarmed around. The creature at the other end of them had a dark body, at least 4 times taller and twice as wide as Jonathan. The surface of its body was covered in fang-filled mouths and glowing eyes. "What's this?" said the creature in a dark and echoing voice. "Let him go," said Jonathan resolutely. The creature's booming laugh hurt Jonathan's ears, and he covered them to relieve the pressure. "You're in over your head, boy," shouted the creature. Jonathan staggered backwards. He suddenly wondered if the creature was right.